Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Syria Podcast. I'm joined once again by Vanessa Beeley. Welcome to the program, Vanessa. I say welcome, but actually the situation in Syria is looking extremely grim and tragic. What is going on there?
Well, basically, we know that the West, particularly, of course, if we're going to talk about UK officials, government officials, journalists like Rory Stewart, Alistair Campbell, representatives of the EU, have all been in Syria, even human rights representatives like Volker Turk and members of the UN human rights agencies have been in Syria normalizing and legitimizing what is effectively a terrorist Al-Qaeda junta government that has taken control in Damascus since the international coup in December last year, and have been entirely silent. All of these organizations and Western governments have been completely silent on the ethnic cleansing programs that have been run either by HTS affiliates directly or by their subordinates, many of which are foreign mercenaries coming from Xinjiang province in China, the Uyghurs, Chechens, Uzbekistanis, Turkmenistanis, etc. And they've been conducting ethnic cleansing programs since they came to power. And of course, this has not been properly recorded by Western regime media outlets like the BBC and Channel 4 and so on. Even if it has been mentioned, it's been very much played down in order to glorify effectively what is a terrorist regime now in control of Syria. And what has happened in the last few days is that Syrians, not necessarily affiliated to the previous Assad government, have risen up to try and prevent the slaughter of their own families, their own civilians, particularly in the coastal areas, Latakia, Tartus, but also inland towards Homs, Hama, which you will know from my reports at UK Column. There are two main Christian towns that resisted Al-Qaeda advances for years, since 2011. And so the ethnic cleansing now is on a scale where actually none of us are able to believe that we're watching again a slaughter that is not being condemned by our governments in the West. It's not being reported on by Western media outlets. And if it is, of course, how are they portraying it? Just as they portray the war between the Palestinians and Israel, it's all the fault of former regime, so-called remnants that are creating divisions and sectarian strife inside Syria, which of course is an entirely false narrative. The reality is that both HTS, security forces, and the various foreign mercenaries under their control, the nationalities of which I've already mentioned, are carrying out two-pronged attacks. Basically, the Arab and HTS affiliates are coming in, murdering the men of villages and towns on the coast, and then sending in the foreign mercenaries to slaughter basically anyone that moves. And that's including women, children. We've seen videos of a 13-year-old child being shot in the head. We've seen children being tortured. Children are being trafficked. There are now reports of organ trafficking, of foreign doctors and medics being on the scene to mop up the dead bodies, but also to take the organs. These are now increasing in number, the reports of these activities. And of course, Mike, we've reported on this for years now about the potential for the white helmet involvement in such crimes, the harvesting of organs and the trafficking of children. And this appears to be the case again now. While Al Jazeera, which of course is Qatari funded, and Qatar poured billions into the regime change war from 2011 onwards, Al Jazeera was responsible for much of the propaganda to support the criminalization of the Syrian government. and Syrian Observatory for Human Rights that is EU funded, based in the UK. Both these media outlets are downplaying the numbers, keeping it in the hundreds of dead. However, we're receiving reports myself from friends on the coast who are telling me literally they are counting the bodies in the streets. We're looking at numbers of anything between 5,000 upwards. Some are saying 7,000 plus, but it's in the thousands, not in the hundreds. And we're watching again another slaughter about which our governments are not only silent, they are effectively endorsing and are complicit in the slaughter that's ongoing in Syria.
So I just want to look, first of all, at the media coverage of Syria since the fall of the Assad government. And in recent days and weeks, we see HTS as being described as Syrian security forces. And we're seeing the Syrian security forces of the Assad government, the remnants of that, being described as, insurgents or I can't remember the terms that they were actually using, but certainly disparaging terms. This is something that we saw right from the beginning. The sort of legitimizing of what are foreign proxies as being something legitimate and something that is justified to be there, and the demonization of the Syrian people who happen to be on the side of the government that was of the day. And therefore, as you say, everything that happens at the hands of HTS is being endorsed and justified by the BBC, by the British press. And I know it shouldn't surprise me, but Al Jazeera as well is right up there pushing this narrative. And actually the language between the BBC and Al Jazeera is pretty much, it's inseparable. So what do we say about mainstream press? I suppose we can't really say anything that we haven't said over the last 20 years.
I mean, I think we've said it before. The media in the West is nothing more than an extension of Western security agencies, so the MI6 and the CIA predominantly. But I also, I will remind people of the leaked UK Foreign Office documents. I think it was back in 2018 or maybe a bit later, which were actually accepted as credible by the then, I can't remember, was he Foreign Minister? Dominic Raab, who tried to excuse their release by saying that government computers had been hacked, but thereby giving credibility to those documents that showed very clearly the UK Foreign Office involvement in the production of media justification for the armed groups on the ground in Syria committing atrocities against Syrian civilians, and in tandem, the criminalization that you talk about of the then Syrian government and Syrian army, which of course are the genuine security forces, just as the real Syria civil defense is the genuine civil defense, not the MI6 incubated white helmets that were established in Turkey and Jordan in 2013 and then embedded with Al-Qaeda and the various terrorist affiliates working to overthrow the Syrian government. So what we're seeing now, of course, is nothing more than an extension of those narratives. And for these media outlets like the BBC, like Channel 4, that were so heavily invested in promoting the terrorist proxies as moderate rebels and justifying their crimes against the Syrian people as being genuine political opposition against the Syrian government that was fighting to prevent the destabilization, partitioning, and fall of Syria that we're seeing now come to fruition, these media outlets are in a position where they can't possibly deviate from the propaganda that they've been promulgating for the last, how many years? 14 years, nearly 15 years, right? Because that would show their rank hypocrisy and criminality in actually enabling and facilitating the regime change war that began even before 2011. But let's say it began in earnest in 2011. Publicly, it began. And those same media outlets are now basically playing a criminal role in justifying the HTS slaughter that is going on inside Syria, the children, the women, the doctors, the medics, the ordinary civilians that are being massacred. And again, this is another familiar pattern, Mike, because instead of retaliating against the armed Syrian popular movement that has reacted to the sectarian cleansing operations in Syria by HTS, what are they doing? They're targeting civilians. And this is exactly what they've done since 2011. They haven't fought a military battle. They fought a battle against civilians. We saw them since 2011 targeting civilians in Homs, in Aleppo, in Damascus, in every city and village in Syria. And that is what they're doing now. They're not fighting the insurgents. They're fighting civilians. They're massacring civilians. This is a sectarian ethnic cleansing program that, as I said, is being sanctioned and endorsed by our governments in the West. And another aspect of this is that our governments in the West, and this ties into what we've been talking about at UK Column, reference the Islamophobia that is being fomented in the West. Our governments are sheltering the same Al-Qaeda and ISIS elements that are now carrying out sectarian programs inside Syria. And I'm not by any means saying that every refugee that has come into Europe from Syria or into the UK from Syria is a member of the terrorist armed groups that were proxies of our governments in the West. But the majority are. And we're even seeing members of those groups in Germany, for example, calling for the ethnic cleansing of Alawites and Shia and Christian. In other words, any of the Syrian minorities that don't adhere not to Muslim ideology or even to Sunni Muslim ideology, but to Wahhabi and Muslim Brotherhood, extremist, fanatic ideology. Because even Sunni Muslims in Syria right now are being slaughtered if they don't comply with the sectarian extremist ideology demonstrated by HTS and their affiliates in Syria.
Right. I want to just discuss a little bit what is actually being lost here, because, I mean, if I just read a sentence from the BBC's coverage of this, Alawites, whose sect is an offshoot of Shia Islam, make up around 10% of Syria's population, which is majority Sunni Muslim. And a narrative that has been running through this whole thing since 2011 has been an attempt to enforce the idea from mainstream press that Syria was only ever going to blow up because it's a hodgepodge of various sects, and they're pushing this sectarian narrative, when in fact Syria, being effectively the cradle of Western civilization, has forever been, yes, a melting pot of a whole range of different religious groupings and so on, who actually got on very well for the majority of the time.
Exactly. It's a very good point to make. The sectarian narratives actually have been completely created and manufactured, not only by the West, but also, of course, by their allies in Israel. The Zionists, as David Miller has talked to us about previously, have been responsible for much of the terminology that has been used to foment sectarian strife in these countries. I mean, even in Iraq, for example, there was a wonderful article by Dr. Sami Ramadani written, I think about 10 years ago, about the fact that even Iraq did not have sectarian issues before the West got involved, in particular the US and the UK. And the same is said for Syria, but in Syria in particular, in all the years that I've been working inside Syria on the ground and living in Syria, Syrians never saw themselves as Christian or Sunni or Alawite or Ismaili. They saw themselves first and foremost, and they still do, as Syrians. And their faith or their beliefs, whatever they were secondary to that national identity and that Arab identity, of course, overarching all of this. I remember that Syria and Egypt were partners in the entire pan-Arab movement under Hafiz al-Assad. And Hafiz al-Assad is known even by, Western commentators, analysts. I recommend everyone reads Patrick Seal's book on Hafiz al-Assad because it will give tremendous insight into how al-Assad managed the country to bring together all of the diversity and the incredibly sort of diverse societal fabric into one country, being Syria. And for Western media like the BBC to basically create these sectarian narratives. I mean, for example, the Alawites are considered or being reported by all of these media outlets as being Assad's tribe. But what they forget is that, yes, President Assad was Alawite. His wife was Sunni. The majority of the Syrian government was Sunni. The majority of the business class in Syria was Sunni. The majority of the Syrian Arab army was Sunni. And they are the majority in Syria, and the majority of the Sunni Muslims in Syria do not accept HTS rule and HTS Sharia dark age mentality and ideology. I mean, in Damascus in the last 2 days, a Sunni religious leader was massacred by HTS. Why? Because he spoke out against the slaughter of Syrians, of Syrian Alawites, Syrian Christians, Syrian Shia, Syrian Sunni by HTS. So what did they do? They went to his home, they dragged him out, they stripped him naked, they beat him, and they slaughtered him. This is a Sunni Sheikh. They have called for the execution of who was formerly the Mufti, the head Mufti in Syria, Mufti Hassoun. Why? Because he was considered too moderate. He wasn't considered to be fanatic enough. He doesn't comply with the Wahhabi ideology that has been birthed in Saudi Arabia, but of course originally created by the British, nor does he agree with the Muslim Brotherhood terrorist ideology, also created by the British.
The organization that keeps getting mentioned in the mainstream press is the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Now, there'll be a lot of people listening to this that weren't around for our coverage, between 2013, let's say, and onwards. So won't have heard of the Syria, or if they have heard of the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, won't know what it is. Just remind us who this is and what their role is.
Yeah, there was a very good article, actually, apart from the work at UK Column, written by Charlie Skelton at The Guardian, and I recommend everyone looks for it and reads it. I can't remember the title, but he goes into quite a lot of detail about what were effectively the anti-Syria complex that was running the narratives. And he includes a write-up on Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Now, I've also completely forgotten the surname of the guy who runs it, Rami, can't remember. But basically it receives funding, or it certainly used to, from the EU. Its reporting is compromised. It's very clearly partisan, both against the former Syrian government and towards the terrorist opposition groups. And it's reporting on the current slaughter across Syria. I mean, it's very much centralized in the coastal areas, but it's extending into other areas, even as far as Damascus and into the northeast, actually, also. We can talk about that in a bit because the Kurds are now also involved in this. So basically, he's responsible for both criminalizing the Syrian government, but making it look very sort of moderate and reasonable, and to a degree downplaying the atrocities committed by the likes of HTS and ISIS and their various branch-off groups. And the numbers that he's putting out, very much like Al Jazeera, are in the low hundreds, when in reality we know that it is in the thousands. I mean, this morning, friends were calling me in tears and saying that their relatives and their families in Latakia, in Tartus, in Banyas, are literally counting the bodies in the streets. There are mass graves being prepared across the region, and identification of the bodies is needed because many of them have been mutilated. Horrendous videos are circulating of beheadings, of the dismemberment of bodies, and so on. And that's what people are dealing with. And that is what is being completely downplayed and justified by these media outlets. Again, we come back to the BBC. How can it be justified when, even if it were to be former members of the Syrian Arab army that have risen up against what is being done to their own families, Mike? We can't forget this. The Syrian Arab army comes from the people, and it comes from the poorest sectors of society, as it does across the world. And when we talk about this demonization of the so-called Alawite tribe because of its connections to President Assad, I can categorically say that from my experience of being in Syria and going to these areas and interviewing Alawite families and Alawite communities, they're some of the poorest and most marginalized communities inside Syria, because actually what the government tried to do was to disconnect itself from the Alawite identity to, if you like, soften diplomacy and political optics for the West, because the West were using this Alawite connection both against the people from that sect and against the government, right? So these people are actually living in some of the poorest areas. They have nothing. And now they're being slaughtered. For what? For just being from a sect? They had nothing. Many of them actually were opposed to the Syrian government. And yet they're still being slaughtered. Their entire families are being slaughtered. And it's indiscriminate. I mean, there are videos now that are being circulated showing HTS members entering villages and towns. And if anything moves, it doesn't matter who they are, they're shot. Literally, these videos are out there. They're publicly available on X, on Telegram. But of course, they're not being picked up and even shown by the likes of the BBC and Channel 4, because just as they've always done in Syria, they cover up what is really happening and present the story as the UK government and its allies want it to be seen.
Just to fill in the gaps there, the name that the guy that runs Syrian Observatory for Human Rights goes by is Abdul Rahman.
Oh, that's it. Yes. Thank you.
But I think his real name is Osama Suleiman. So it's a bit strange anyway. I mean, he famously runs this out of his home in Coventry.
Yeah. Yes, he has a laundry business from memory.
That's right, or a clothing shop or something. I don't know. But over the years, that organization has been used by the mainstream media because he claims to have people on the ground giving him the information, but that organization, whatever it is, some kind of, whether it is one guy in his home or whether it's some kind of intelligence cutout, has been used by the mainstream press to justify narratives since 2011.
Actually, it's worth mentioning, I can't remember which year it was, maybe 2016, that the UN stopped using Syrian Observatory for Human Rights because they said he was inaccurate. So that's worth noting. But he does have, as you said, whether he's paid to do so, whether he is confirming his own bias, which is against the former Syrian government and certainly pro the Muslim Brotherhood factions that, of course, have been weaponized against various Syrian governments for decades. And as I keep repeating, were created by the British in Egypt in the late 30s, from maybe the late 20s. And another point that I want to make, there has been information circulating also on social media that the general who is taking command of the Syrian popular resistance that is not from one faction. It's basically a conglomeration of Syrian army, of local resistance, national defense forces, and so on. The general's name is General Khaith Dalla. His photo is on social media. But of course, someone has started the narrative that he was a member of the 4th Division and he was very close to Iran. And why is this important? Because the other narrative that the BBC and Channel 4 have always peddled on Syria is that all of these forces, including the Syrian Arab Army, were nothing more than proxies of Iran to destabilize the region, to allow Iranian expansionism, etc. But this is actually entirely false. Iran and even Hezbollah are not involved in the current conflict that is ongoing in Syria since December the 8th, when HTS took control in Damascus. And Khaith Dalla, the general now in command of the resistance forces, the Syrian resistance forces, is actually or was a former member of the Republican Guard. He's known by people in Syria, both those who fought with him and those who know him well, to be loyal to Syria. He doesn't have any affiliation outside of Syria, whether it is Russian or Iranian, none. He is a Syrian patriot. And so this is just to demonstrate how the media is distorting and twisting reality in order to confirm the narratives that they have been disseminating since 2011 to discredit the Syrian government and to discredit the Syrian army for its operations to cleanse Syria of the terrorist proxies that are being funded, trained, equipped, armed, weaponized by the UK, by the US, the EU, Turkey, the Gulf states, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. And by the way, the Gulf states as a collective have put out a statement condemning the insurgents in Syria and congratulating Jolani and his security forces for taking measures against that insurgent. So what does that mean? That means that the Gulf states who funded this war, who provided the terrorist forces to conduct the war against the Syrian government, are now endorsing the slaughter of Syrian communities and sects that don't comply with their own ideology.
It would be my observation as well that the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights has always downplayed the atrocities of these people over the years. So the latest report on the BBC is that more than 1,000 people have been killed in the past 2 days. So on the fair assumption, and it is a fair assumption that they are again downplaying, then that also reinforces the kinds of numbers that you're talking about. It is atrocious, but I suppose one of the things that a lot of people won't understand still is why, because they have this perception of Islam being a cohesive thing, why these states that you're talking about were so determined to get rid of Assad and why they would be supporting this behavior at the moment?
Because all of these states, which are the incubators for Wahhabism and for Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood ideologies, not only did they have geopolitical interests inside Syria, I mean, one of the reasons that the war was waged against Syria was because President Bashar al-Assad turned down the Qatari-Turkish oil pipeline in favor of the Russian-Iranian partnership. And so Qatar saw the overthrow of the Syrian government as potential for, let's say, unification of the Muslim Brotherhood elements through Turkey and Qatar inside Syria. But all of these states also have been busy normalizing with Israel. And that's another important factor in this, because while HTS have basically enabled and facilitated the Zionist expansion into Syria from the early days of the takeover, when we know that Israel bombed basically all of Syria's capability, military capability, defense capability, its air defense, its radar systems, its navy, and removed Syria's ability to both defend itself and also to wage any kind of campaign against the Zionist expansionist movement. At the same time, while these massacres are being conducted against Syrians by HTS, Israel is advancing. In the last 48 hours, it's advanced further to the north of Dara, which is south of Damascus. We talked on Wednesday on UK Column about the Zionist agenda to basically link territory from the south up the eastern border of Syria and to link with the Kurdish separatist factions that are considered to be, to some degree, a settler movement on behalf of Israel, and eventually to be able to reach the Euphrates River in Iraq, which is part of the Greater Israel Project. And so while HTS is waging this war backed by the Gulf states that have either already normalized with Israel or are in the process of doing so, as in the case of Saudi Arabia, Israel is expanding into Syria and taking control of more territory, more towns, more villages in the south, and is not being hindered in any way by HTS. In fact, I mean, the recent statements by Jolani condemning the Israeli occupation of Syrian territory are empty, hollow rhetoric, because in effect, HTS has since 2011 been another proxy of Israel. We know that Israel has provided hospital treatment. It's been admitted that they provided weapons to the Free Syrian Army and to effectively Al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria. They have on occasion provided air cover and support for HTS operations, even during the battles to take over Damascus back in December. This is what they were doing. And prior to that, that's what they were doing. And so therefore, the partnership between Israel and HTS has been very clear for a long time. And the partnership then extends into the Gulf states that have normalized with Israel.
We started off talking about the mainstream British and your Western media's coverage of this. What has happened to SANA, that's the Syrian Arab News Agency, since the change of government? Have they also had a change of personnel?
Yes, of course. I mean, there's been a huge laying off of staff, particularly from the minority sectors of Syrians on the coast and so on. So while HTS came in to presumably repair all of the economic damage that was done to the Syrian government through sanctions and war and so on, the reality is the situation is worse, and Sana'a is no different. The staff that were pro-government, let's say, or were pro-Syria, many of these staff were not necessarily pro-Assad or pro the Syrian government. They had reservations about the Syrian government and the corruption and so on. But they were against the HTS project, the Western-backed HTS project. But now all of those staff have either been removed or killed and have been replaced with staff that are either too terrified to speak out, which is ironic, as that was the accusation levied at the Syrian government prior to December 2024, that there was no freedom of speech, that people couldn't criticize the government, which was entirely untrue. I lived in Syria for the last 5 years. I can categorically tell you that every taxi driver, every kiosk vendor, everyone would be criticizing the government in one way or another publicly. And yet now they can't. And so therefore the staff of Sana'a, the Syrian Arab News Agency, are following a narrative. And the narrative, of course, is aligned with the HTS narrative, which I have to say is being managed by the MI6 predominantly, as it always has been. And the fact that you do have individuals like Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell, who basically provided the spin for war criminals like Tony Blair, are now there spinning HTS and presenting them as a legitimate government in Syria without condemning what they're doing. And funny how these same individuals have gone awfully quiet right now.
Aside from yourself, who do people go to get, accurate information about what's going on? Because, I mean, we can't, of course, underestimate how hard it is for people that are there, and how hard it is to get real information out from from that situation.
Yeah, I mean, it is extremely difficult. There are some very good channels on Telegram. What I might do, Mike, is to compile a list. Many of them are Arabic, but you can, on Telegram, you have a translate into English function. So you can follow them quite easily. And there are a number of X accounts that are trying to do their best to disseminate the atrocities that are being committed. I'm hoping I will also do a report on Wednesday on what's going on. It is very distressing viewing. I'm not going to downplay that. It's not pleasant. But, how many more slaughters do we have to sit through before we actually hold our own regimes accountable for this, Mike? The British government, successive governments, it doesn't matter whether it's Starmer or Boris Johnson or David Cameron, they're all responsible for this. And they're all continuing to be responsible for it. And they have to be held account. We've sat through how many months of a Palestinian genocide? Are we going to sit through another 5-6 months of a Syrian genocide of minorities? Because that's what it is. It's a systematic ethnic cleansing of anyone belonging to a particular sect, and to any sect that doesn't comply with this backward, extremist, fanatic ideology, which has nothing to do with Islam. I really want to reiterate that for people that are listening. This has nothing to do with the rising Islamophobia, which is being again orchestrated in the UK and in the EU and even in the US. This is not Islam. This is a distorted version of Islam that originated with the British. And we have to really keep that in mind when we're viewing what is going on. Muslims generally across all branches and sects of Islam do not condone what is happening. They are under threat. Their Islam is under threat from this fanaticism. And this fanaticism, of course, is coming in also from abroad. It's coming in from the Uyghurs. It's coming in from the Chechens. It's coming in from European countries, of course, where these extremist elements have not only been welcomed when they come in as refugees from inside Syria, but also among radicalized communities that are being radicalized both by the Gulf states, but also by the intelligence agencies within those countries in order to then send them to fight so-called jihad in whatever country they're looking to destabilize or occupy by proxy. And I think, we can publish all of the channels that are publishing credible information. I do have to put in the caveat that it's very difficult at the moment. Most people inside Syria are terrified to speak out. And it's very hard, even for me, to get confirmation of some of the stories that are circulating. So bear that in mind. But nevertheless, it's happening. And there is enough hard evidence out there now to justify my saying the numbers are in their thousands, not in their hundreds. And I think really, yes, spreading and sharing the information is incredibly important, but holding your government representative, your local representative to account is even more important. They have to be made aware that you're aware and that you condemn what is happening and you condemn their silence. And the same with the media. They have to be held account. Everyone is very quick to come to us and to criticize our reporting or to hold us account for perhaps not covering the story that they want to see covered, right? But hold the BBC, hold Channel 4, hold CNN, hold all of these media outlets who are effectively responsible for the slaughter that is now happening inside Syria.
You're right. We do get criticism for not covering this topic or that topic or the other topic. What we don't get criticism for is for lying about the topics that we do cover. Now, the difference here is that the BBC, Channel 4, and other mainstream media are lying about what is going on. They're lying by misrepresenting the people that are carrying out these atrocities.
And by omission.
And by omission. So, if people criticize us for not covering topic X, Y, and Z, fine. But don't forget that whatever we do cover, we cover to the best of our ability. And truthfully, that is somewhat different from what mainstream press is doing. And that is why I absolutely reinforce what you're saying. We need to hold the mainstream press to account. Now, one of the problems, I'm going to try and express this as best I can, and I appreciate that this is going to come across as a bit off for some who may be listening to this. But part of the reason that I think that people aren't engaging with this topic in the way that it needs to be engaged with is because of this idea that people have that all of Islam is, aggressive and wants to cut off our heads and this kind of thing. This is a narrative that is reinforced to a large degree by the same media and by also other voices in politics that perhaps cover other topics in a good way, and therefore what they say about Islam is accepted. But we have to understand that what we're witnessing and what has been going on with Islam for decades, 100 years maybe, is a deep state operation. And, when I was talking to Carl Zah about the Uyghur situation the other day on that discussion, and he was talking about how radical Islam was a creation of, the deep state of the CIA in the case of Afghanistan and so on. Because it is a deep state operation, we have to be very careful about getting an understanding of what is actually going on. And what staggers me is that people will be up in arms about a deep state run false flag in the West, which may have killed 20 or 30 people. And it's being described as being some form of Islamic attack on the West, while at the same time, people that we have indoctrinated, funded, and armed and helped be in a place are massacring thousands in that place. And somehow that's acceptable, but the 20 or 30 that get killed in the West is unacceptable. And yet it's the same hands behind both operations. Until people get to grips with that and understand that there's something else going on, and that actually their worry about Islam itself as a thing is not justified or rather their lack of willingness to engage with this topic is not justified by some concern about Islam as a thing. People have got to get to grips with this, and have got to get to grips with what is actually going on and who is behind it, and recognize that our tax dollars are being used to create these issues in the world, and to set aside whatever their thoughts about Islam in general are and stick to the specifics of what's going on. I think that is something that people need to do.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. And we've discussed
I don't know if I've expressed that very well.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely clear. And I mean, it's very much what I've been saying in this conversation, but also previously on UK Column when we've, tried to address the rising backlash against Muslim communities in the UK and in the EU and in the US. Is that, and this is what is so important to say. If you're going to consider yourself as a victim of what you perceive to be Islam, you have to understand that the Muslims, the majority of Muslims, are also a victim of this version of Islam, because it's not the Islam that they want to identify with. It has been midwifed by the British and weaponized by the British for decades, particularly inside Syria. I've written about the 75 years of CIA and MI6 interference in the internal affairs of Syria, the weaponization of the Muslim Brotherhood against various governments in Syria that were not compliant with the Western agenda. And it goes back way before Hafiz al-Assad, by the way. It goes back to the inception of Muslim Brotherhood by the hand of the British in the region in order to disrupt and sectarianize, if I can make that a verb, the pan-Arabic movement and to create the divisions they need to partition the Middle East along the kind of Sykes-Picot clean break doctrine, Zionist, Greater Israel plans, right? They're weapons, just as COVID was a weapon in the hands of the deep state, just as 9/11 was a weapon in the hands of the deep state in order to initiate the so-called global war on terror, during which terror has grown exponentially. I mean, this is the thing, Mike, is people, I think, and I don't really like speculating about how people read narratives or are affected by narratives, but I think they allow themselves to be driven by an emotional narrative. The media and the deep state, and the media is an extension of the deep state, know exactly how to trigger and to push the buttons. They know how to influence behavior, and that's what's happening.
Just an example, an email that's just come in to me with headlines like UK's rapid Islamization, the silent transformation unfolding. It gets better because later on in the email, it says also the attached, if this isn't frightening, what is? And the headline is, Islam now has access to UK's nuclear weapons. I mean, this is...
Yeah, but what about the Zionist capture of the UK? I mean, this is it. They're getting distracted from what is the real issue into something that isn't even an issue. Or if it is an issue, it's being manufactured. It's being orchestrated by the deep state that has orchestrated these events for decades. But people forget that connection. The Muslims in Syria are fighting a war against a deep state construct from the UK. That's as clear as I can make it. And by the way, it's not only the Muslims. Maronite Christians have been slaughtered in the last 3 days. Christians from all communities, from Catholic, from Orthodox, Greek Malachite, evangelical, Presbyterian, are at risk. And Christians, by the way, our government has been ethnically cleansing Christians by proxy for decades. Why? Because they want the Christians out of the region so they can make this a full-on sectarian war between the extremist, fanatic factions that they created, they helped create, and they fund, and they legitimize through their media outlets against those Muslims that are resisting this takeover by these, I don't know how else to describe them, forces of darkness. And that may sound melodramatic, but that's effectively what they are. Who is responsible for the organ trafficking, for the harvesting of children, for the production of false chemical weapon attacks that actually used the bodies of children, half-drugged children, to produce what are effectively snuff videos to swing public opinion against the Syrian government and its allies in Syria? This is the level of nefariousness and evil that we're dealing with. And if we buy into these narratives, we're effectively supporting and facilitating that evil that is being permeated by our government, by world governments, against innocent populations, whether it's innocent populations in the UK or innocent populations in the Middle East or West Asia, in Syria in particular, right now. And that's what we have to bear in mind. The Syrians are no different to us, Mike. They want to send their kids to school. They want the best for their children. They want their children to grow up in a safe environment. Why did the majority of Muslims come to the UK and to the EU? Because our governments were bombing their countries and making it impossible for them to live in those countries. The sanctions against Iraq killed how many? 500,000 children? We're responsible for whatever exodus is happening in these countries, whether it's Christian, whether it's Muslim, regardless. And it's funny how the Christians are given easy access to countries outside the Middle East, by the way, which is part of the ethnic cleansing program.
And it's that I find the most sickening part of this whole anti-Islam movement in the UK, because we were saying at the time, if this war goes ahead, there's going to be migration happens. But nobody stood up and said, don't have the war. In fact, quite the opposite.
Stop the war. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Where were those people when the wars were happening? I haven't seen a major march against a UK or an MI6 CIA-led intervention by proxy or directly militarily in the Middle East since Iraq. I haven't seen it. Where are those people marching? Where are those people trying to stop a war against Syria that has led to what we're seeing right now? The problem of immigration, the problem of radical elements now embedded in European countries and in the UK. Those same radical elements that were actually an asset of the UK. I keep saying this. Sadiq Khan in 2016 offered them amnesty to come back to the UK. He actually opened the doors to Al-Qaeda Brits to come back to the UK. So who is responsible for this?
Indeed, and they tried to use Shamima Begum as some kind of cover for that by keeping the focus on her while they were bringing all these other people back. Also, while they trafficked her, Mike, they trafficked her out of the country to go to Syria as an ISIS bride. So they were actually responsible for that. It's disgusting how now they're revoking her British citizenship while she's rotting in one of the ISIS camps with her children inside Syria, which are being funded, by the way. Those camps are being funded by the UK. People may not be aware of that, but the UK is actually funding the camps that are holding more than 15,000 ISIS fighters and their families. Why is that? Why are British resources going to the funding of holding camps? And they're holding camps, they're not prisons, because those ISIS fighters are being circulated in the region to carry out operations on behalf of the US and the UK. That's where people should be directing their anger, not against innocent Muslims and Muslim communities in the UK. They should be directing their anger against their own government and agencies, and including the media, that have basically enabled and facilitated the return of radical elements to the UK in order to destabilize the UK and to destabilize the EU. We are pretty much out of time. What would be your final comment on what's going on at the moment, and what would you like to see people doing at this stage? I mean, maybe we've covered this already, but just end the program with some final comments.
I think, yes, first of all, identify the channels. I will send a series of links to include in the show notes, and share the information. I mean, you can go to my accounts on X and on Telegram, at the very least, and share what I'm sharing that I have generally managed to verify. But at the same time, the most important thing is to really go for the jugular of your governmental representatives, of members of the government, of the UN, of human rights organizations, of the BBC, of Channel 4, that are again starting to rejuvenate the narratives that Channel 4 in particular was promulgating about the Syrian government and so on. Hold them to account. It can't be only up to independent media outlets like UK Column to do this. We don't have the resources. We need the public resources. We need you to actually do something to stop this. We can't sit through another slaughter, another sectarian massacre that is being done under the radar because your government, your media, your UN agencies, human rights organizations are saying nothing. They are criminally responsible for what is currently happening, for the absolute slaughter that is going on, for the mass graves. They'll always point the fingers at the enemies or the perceived enemies of the UK regime, whether it's Russia, whether it's Syria under the previous Syrian government, it doesn't matter. They'll Hitlerize anyone that doesn't comply with their foreign policy. But when it comes to actual massacres that are being done by their own proxies, by their own assets in another country, silence. And we're responsible for raising our voices against that. All of us, every single one of us. And I can't remember the quote that you came up with once, Mike, but if one person said, out of how many millions, what can I do? If millions raise their voices, we can do something. And it doesn't take much. It might save a life. It might save the next child that's about to be beheaded or slaughtered or executed or tortured or trafficked or have their organs taken from them. That's how serious it is right now. You can save a life.
Vanessa, I'm going to say thank you very much for that today. I mean, just to end, there will be, of course, people that will find some of what we said today challenging because it challenges their view of what is going on in the West, never mind what's going on in the Middle East. I would just urge everybody to think carefully about it, to try to appreciate the deep state operations that have been running, which may not only be affecting events in the Middle East, but maybe also affecting our own view of the world and a view of what's going on around us. And to, as you say, get involved in pulling the lid off this. You know, we have not yet, you and I, gone into any depth on the trafficking and the organ trafficking aspect of this. But it is something that we've seen from Ukraine. It's something that we've seen from Syria since 2011. And I think that is an area that we do need to touch on. It is really dark, but it has to be done. All of this has to stop because the people that are being tortured and killed in the country, as horrible as that is in fact only part of the story.
Absolutely. And people can go. I've been sharing on X and Telegram some of the archive of my past work on the White Helmet involvement in, or certainly they're accused of being involved in organ harvesting, child trafficking. And there is a huge archive of my work, of UK Column work in collaboration with UK Column on the White Helmets, the MI6 involvement in their creation, their affiliation with Al-Qaeda, their involvement in the chemical attacks, false flags that Dr. Piers Robinson has covered extensively, also, again, in collaboration with UK Column. It's well worth going back. And Mike, we've already got a page on the White Helmets, right? But I'm wondering if it's worth putting out some of the more relevant articles so people can easily find them right now, because, of course, the White Helmets are again involved in mopping up the Al-Qaeda operations. And that for me ultimately means that they're also involved again in the more nefarious activities that, of course, we saw also in former Yugoslavia. The founder of the White Helmets, James Lemessurier, who was British military intelligence, was involved in the transformation of the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was a mix of Al-Qaeda and Albanian warlords who were at the time involved in cross-border organ trafficking operations when Lemessurier was involved in transforming them into a more acceptable Kosovo security corps. And he then carried that transformation and that project forward into Syria when he created the White Helmets. So I think it's, again, we're at a stage where it's important for people who maybe missed that history that we covered, for it to be rejuvenated and put back out there for people to fully understand what we're talking about.
We'll leave it there for today. Thank you very much for joining me, Vanessa. Tragic circumstances. We will be back very soon. So thank you.